bit of a continuation from last week's video this week. So if you haven't seen it, go check it out. Hi guys, welcome to PMyth Gaming. This week I wanted to expand on something that I kind of touched on in last week's video, in which I was ranting about Pokémon Sword and Shield. In that video, I mentioned that it's probably unfair to judge a game based on a list of things that we'd like to see included. And I've kind of been dwelling on that. Primarily, I've been thinking about Breath of the Wild. Much of the praise that game received was not only predicated on the world and mechanics and gameplay itself, but also on how it totally reinvented the Zelda series. It charted a new course for the franchise and was lauded for the way it shunned the setup of previous games, in favour of this bold new open-air approach. That's all well and good, and certainly part of the appeal was the fact that it totally shook up the Zelda formula. But is it really right to praise a game just because it does something different to the titles in the franchise that have come before it? Surely a game is just good or bad regardless. Is Breath of the Wild merely a great game rather than an exceptional one, but has been unduly praised because of the way it totally deviated from its predecessors? I don't necessarily agree with this, I'm just kind of spitballing here. If it is indeed the case that Breath of the Wild should only be judged on its own in isolation, then much of the criticism levied at Pokémon Sword and Shield is totally unfounded. Extracting Sword and Shield from its context means you can't criticise it for missing Pokémon. You can't lambast it for not creating a more epic world. You can't poo-poo it for using the same 8 gym formula we've seen generation after generation. On the other hand, you could, however, criticise it for gating certain Pokémon behind specific versions. Taken in isolation, that seems a fairly crappy thing to do, but we've grown accustomed to it over the last 20 years or so and now just take it as part and parcel of the Pokémon experience. Much of the frustration with those games has been born out of fans' expectations that have grown with the franchise over the last 20 years. And there ain't no shortage of expectations when it comes to Pokémon. And so it seems kind of paradoxical for me to, on the one hand, praise Breath of the Wild based on the context of what came before it, and on the other suggest that it's unfair to criticise Pokémon based on the context in which it exists. I think this is kind of an interesting dilemma for us as gamers, as critics, and for the industry as a whole. Ultimately, there's no separating the fact that Breath of the Wild was such an enjoyable experience partly because it was something we'd never seen in the franchise before. The context in which the game was released influenced people's opinions of it. I don't think we can get away from that, it seems to just be intrinsic in some way. And so, when it comes to Pokémon, I don't think we can simply look at them in isolation and say good or bad. The context of the franchise and expectations that have grown with it are inevitably going to be part of the conversation, whether that's a good thing or not. With both Pokémon Sword and Shield and Breath of the Wild, we had certain expectations and attachments to these franchises going in. But whereas Breath of the Wild did away with things we took for granted in order to deliver something new and fresh, Pokémon did away with things we'd taken for granted in the series and served up, essentially, more of the same, but less. And that, ultimately, I think, is the source of fans' frustration. I'm kind of just spitballing here and thinking through this quandary as I go, so I'm genuinely interested to hear what you, dear viewer, think about this. Should we just judge games in isolation, or does the context of the franchise and the previous games matter? And if they do, to what extent do we say that certain expectations are fair games and others are just wild fantasies? Like, where do we draw the line? Let me know in the usual place. Thanks very much for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed coming on this pseudo-intellectual journey with me. If you want more of my ramblings, there's plenty more PMyth Gaming here on Nintendo Village, such as, this episode. And if you like that, you can always subscribe to so you never miss another one. This show goes out every Friday, but there's tons more stuff here on Nintendo Village. And be sure to check out the nintendovillage.com for Nintendo news, reviews, features, podcasts, all that cool stuff. Thanks again for watching. I'll catch you all next week.